Hello and welcome to the Nexus. Today we're looking at the violence in the Middle East. On one side, Israel, with one of the world's most advanced militaries, and on the other side, Gaza, a tiny and impoverished Palestinian territory which has been blockaded for years and is run by Hamas. As always, the world has one eye on the United States, which, as Israel's greatest backer, is supposedly the only country in the world with the power to intervene. But what is President Joe Biden really prepared to do? In his multiple runs for the presidency beginning in the 1980s, he bent over backwards to show his support for Israel. But he now finds himself in an invidious position and unsure of which way the political wind is blowing in America in 2021.
Palestinians and Israelis equally deserve to live in safety and security and enjoy equal measure of freedom, prosperity, and democracy. But Israel has a right to defend itself.
Absolute right to defend itself.
Fully supportive of Israel's right to defend itself.
The faces have changed, the political parties have changed, but America's red line on Israel is unchanging. Its closest ally in the Middle East has a right to defend itself. And to that end, Washington gives Israel $3.8 billion every year, primarily to spend on its military. This formalized direct funding has been going on since the mid-80s and was enthusiastically embraced by the 44-year-old Senator Joe Biden.
There's no apology to be made. None. It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region.
The United States also protects Israel at the United Nations. Over the past couple of weeks, it's blocked the UN Security Council several times from issuing statements condemning Israel's military response. In stark contrast, Washington is careful to avoid showing empathy with Palestinians, lest it appear as support for Hamas, which Washington designates a terrorist group.
Do Palestinians have a right to self-defense?
In broadly speaking, Saeed, we believe in the concept of self-defense. We believe it applies to any state.
Do you regard Palestine as a state?
I wasn't
referring. Do you think you don't in the context of the ICC and the UN? So are you saying that you do not? If it applies to any state, are you saying that Palestinians don't have a right to self-defense?
I was making a broader point, not attached to Israel or Palestinians in that case.
This line of questioning and disingenuous response has been going on for years. Jen Psaki is Biden's White House spokeswoman. She holds the line now as she held it 7 years ago in the same role under President Barack Obama.
Israel has the right to defend themselves.
Do you believe that the Palestinians in Gaza have the right to defend themselves?
I'm not sure what you're getting at.
Does the president believe that Palestinians have a right to self-defense?
The president, in his statement yesterday, also made clear that he underscored the importance of working to advance peace throughout the region, including between Israelis and Palestinians.
And it's no wonder that White House officials don't feel comfortable answering those questions when their political masters make it so clear what their priorities are and have done for years.
If I were a Jew, I'd be a Zionist. I am a Zionist. You don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist.
Unyielding commitment to the survival, security, and success of the Jewish state of Israel.
Addressing the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, has been almost an obligatory stop for any candidate hoping to reach the White House. All political upside and no political downside to expressing one's unswerving support for Israel.
It is wonderful to look out and see so many great friends.
Or at least that's been the case until now, as Andrew Yang soon found out.
Andrew Yang is now apologizing after he issued a statement on the violence and ongoing conflict in Israel and, of course, Gaza.
Yang is running to be mayor of New York, but ran into trouble when he tweeted, "I'm standing with the people of Israel who are coming under bombardment attacks and condemn the Hamas terrorists. The people of NYC will always stand with our brothers and sisters in Israel who face down terrorism and persevere." Yang was immediately criticized on social media, and the hashtag Yang supports genocide soon began trending. Yang quickly rode back, saying the tweet was overly simplistic and that he mourns for every Palestinian life taken before its time, as I do for every Israeli. You'll see more signs of change in the US Congress, where America's first Muslim congresswomen, Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, decry what's happening to Palestinians at the hands of the Israelis.
It is a conflict where one country, funded and supported by the United States government, continues an illegal military occupation over another group of people.
We must condition aid to Israel on compliance with international human rights and end the apartheid.
Their voices are still very much a minority in a Congress of 535 people, but they do have allies in the so-called progressive wing of the Democratic Party, who are linking the Palestinian cause to that of civil rights in the United States.
The United States must acknowledge its role in the injustice and human rights violations of Palestinians.
Last summer, when Black Lives Matter protesters took to the streets to demand justice, they were met with force. They faced tear gas, rubber bullets, and a militarized police, just as our Palestinian brothers and sisters are facing in Jerusalem today. Our destinies are tied.
Now, if anything is to change between Israel and the Palestinians, it will only come about if America supports it. And so today we are speaking to 4 American citizens with very different opinions and backgrounds. And they are the eminent Jewish American law professor, Alan Dershowitz, who has written numerous books in defense of Israel and says he also supports Palestine. Malak Shalabi is a Palestinian American law student at the University of Washington and a member of American Muslims for Palestine. We're also joined by Mark Perry, who's written extensively on the US military and US-Israeli affairs and works at the Quincy Institute, a think tank based in Washington, D.C. And finally, we're joined by Nada HaShemi, a Middle East expert at the University of Denver. Thank you all for joining us here on the Nexus today. Much appreciated. Professor Dershowitz, I would like to start with you. As we heard in that report, Joe Biden said it's the best $3 billion of investment we've ever made. Were there not an Israel, the United States would have to invent an Israel to protect our interests in the region. Do you still agree with that assertion?
President Biden is 100% correct. He, along with other Americans and the Secretary of State, all understand Hamas's tactic. Every few years, they find an excuse to fire rockets at Israeli civilians from behind Palestinian civilians. It's called the dead baby strategy, or the CNN strategy. They know it puts Israel to the tragic choice of either allowing rockets to attack their own civilians and kill young people in bunkers, or for Israel to respond. And inevitably, if Israel responds, there will be some civilian casualties because that's part of Hamas's goal. Most Americans agree with that. Most Americans support Israel. So although there's been a change at the fringes of the Democratic Party on the left side, the vast majority of Americans still support Israel's right of self-defense.
Okay, we're going to get a response to that from everyone on the panel, but I would just like to put it to you that the question was along the lines of, what does America get out of supporting Israel with $3 billion, now $3.8 billion a year, which primarily goes on the military, and supporting them at the United Nations when there is a reputational cost every time they do so?
No, I don't think it's a reputational cost. I think most of the countries in the world agree that Israel has the right of self-defense. Israel, the United States provides billions of dollars to Jordan and to Egypt, and Israel pays it back in multiples. Intelligence, the Abraham Accords, having a united front against Iran. Israel is America's most reliable, strongest ally in the Middle East. It knows that was elected, Israel will be an ally of the United States, and that's why there's always been bipartisan support for Israel among mainstream Democrats and Republicans, though not at the extreme fringes of both parties.
Malak Shalabi, I'd like to give you an opportunity to reply to that.
Yeah, Professor Dershowitz, I have a question for you. When you open up a book to read it, do you start right in the middle? When you begin with referencing Hamas, you're neglecting the history, the deep history of forced dispossession, displacement that has happened since 1948, the displacement of my grandfather, one of the 850,000 people forced out of their homes, the 600 plus Palestinian villages destroyed during the Nakba. Let's talk about dead babies. Let's talk about 5-year-old Susie, who was left for 11 hours in Gaza last night, hanging upside down in the rubble. We're hearing her story now because she managed to survive. But Professor Dershowitz, with all respect, with all due respect, understand that the tides are shifting. Americans are starting to see Israel for what it is, a flagrant human rights violator, a supporter of apartheid, an institutor of apartheid.
Can I answer that question?
And to continue, please, a December 2018 poll found that 56% of Democrats supported sanctions against Israel for continuing to colonize Palestinian land. The tides are shifting because people are starting to see what's happening on the ground from Palestinians themselves. And 55% of Americans support the establishment of a Palestinian state, which the U.S. has yet to recognize. This is the reality of the youth.
And let's allow Professor Dershowitz to respond, please. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'd like to answer that question. Look, the Palestinians could have had a state in 1938, 1948, 1967, 2000, 2001, 2008. They turned down statehood on every occasion. Americans know that. Americans know that Israel is prepared to recognize a two-state solution, as am I. I am pro-Israel and pro-Palestine. I think it would be far better for Israel and for Palestine to have two states. When Israel abandoned the Gaza Strip could have become a Singapore on the Mediterranean. They left behind farm implements, etc. And then Hamas took over violently, and they sent rockets.
Professor
Dershowitz had to prevent materials coming into Gaza. Americans realize that, and so there is no change.
Professor Dershowitz, you've mentioned the number of times that you believe the Palestinians have walked away from the talks, but a very eminent U.S. public intellectual, Noam Chomsky, would say it's actually the Israelis and the Palestinians who have rejected every opportunity, including what happened after the Taba meetings, when he believes that they had their best opportunity to end the conflict. Ehud Barak of Israel walked away.
Well, I was there in 1967. I helped draft Resolution 242 of the National Security Council, which would have returned the lands captured in return for peace. Israel accepted it, and the Palestinians went to Khartoum and issued their three famous no's: no negotiation, no recognition, no peace. The Palestinians could have had a state so many times. They don't know how to take yes for an answer, and they never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Now is the time to sit down and make peace, have a two-state solution that require compromises on both sides.
Okay, we'll come to the possibility of a solution later. Mark Perry, you've shaken your head on pretty much every point that Professor Dershowitz has made. I think it's time you came in.
Well, I'd like to answer your original question, whether being an ally of Israel helps the United States. And it doesn't. The best defender of America's interest in the Middle East is the United States of America, not Israel. Our friendship with Israel actually undermines our interest in the Middle East. And that's not just me saying that. That was said by General David Petraeus 10 years ago. He's hardly a fringe political figure in the United States. And if you talk to U.S. military commanders, they'll tell you that this continuing conflict hurts our reputation. Our ties with Israel undermine our interests. That's been true for years. It's still true now. It's especially true when Israel is killing Palestinians in Gaza. Mr. Dershowitz, Professor Dershowitz, is a serial liar on Hamas. He has been for years. There are no human shields in Gaza. What's happening in Gaza is a slaughter that is being perpetrated by the Israeli Defense Forces.
Professor Dershowitz, your response, please.
Well, to say there are no human shields in Gaza, every report has indicated that Hamas fires its rockets from mosques, from schools, from UN facilities. You know, the myth is that Gaza is the most crowded area in the world. It's not. Tel Aviv has higher density than Gaza. There are miles and miles of open land in Gaza. They could easily fire their rockets and build their tunnels in open areas, not in areas near schools. We have reports. The UPI reported in 2014 that Hamas took over its building and was firing from behind schools. There were videotapes. And to call me a serial liar and then to state a categorical lie that Hamas has no human shields.
Excuse me, Professor Dershowitz, don't ever compare Tel Aviv to what's happening in Gaza. Don't ever compare what's happening in Tel Aviv to what's happening in Gaza. 45% unemployment rate in Gaza, 95% of water undrinkable
All the
in
fault
Gaza.
of Hamas.
Siege imposed by Israel for 10 plus years, where medicine, any type of healthcare, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, was shut out. We want to know what Americans want. What are Americans looking at? Americans want justice. Americans want investment in their vulnerable communities. We can't afford to send $10 million every single day to a foreign military occupation. Our people are dying. This is where our money needs to go.
Okay, Nader Hashemi, Malak, let's just give Nader a chance to come in for the first time. Nader?
Well, look, Professor Dershowitz is doing what he has always done, and that is repeat talking points straight out of the office of Benjamin Netanyahu. I mean, his track record on this topic is egregious. Nobody takes him seriously except those people who, live on the same planet that he does. The fact of the matter is, you want to talk about Gaza? Let's talk about the fact that Gaza is an open-air prison. That's not my characterization. That's the characterization of the former British Prime Minister. Gaza has a population of 2 million people. Half of them are children, 70% unemployment, 90% of the water is toxic. Professor Dershowitz wants to talk about Hamas. I'm more than happy to engage with him on that topic, but on one condition: that he's willing to talk about the moral equivalent of Hamas on the Israeli side. Part of Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition contains people who are outright racists, fascists, supporters of Israel's extreme settlement policy. And these are the people who actually have political power. The difference between Hamas and the moral equivalent of Hamas on the Israeli side is that the United States supports the people in Netanyahu's coalition.
You have three guests
as we speak.
Three guests who are calling you liars.
Just a second,
and who are very
Nader.
anti-Israel.
Just a second,
I'm
Nader.
the only person here supporting the right
Just a
of
second,
Israel
Nader,
to
if you
engage
wouldn't
in
mind.
self-defense. So at least give me the opportunity
Yes.
to have equal time, please.
Professor Dershowitz, you're entirely right. You are a minority on this particular panel, and it will be difficult for you to perhaps cope with everyone making their points in opposition. In opposition. Oh, it's not difficult. Okay. Okay, then I will give you the time you need to rebut what Nader has said. But can we just please focus, all of us, on the fact that this isn't a discussion of all the horrors on the ground. This is about what is good for America. Each of you are American citizens, and presumably it is very important to you, the interests of the United States. After all, that's what the foreign policy of any country should serve, first and foremost, is that country. So the United States, what is good for the United States? Nader, I didn't hear your opinion on that. What is good for the United States now, and is it the same as what has been good for the United States, or bad, perhaps, in your opinion, over the last 4 or 5 decades?
Well, I think what's good for the United States is to stand up to the values, or for the values, that the United States routinely claims are foundational to who we are as a country. Equality, international law, respect for human rights, etc. I mean, these were actually the principles that Joe Biden campaigned on, in contrast to the horrific policies of Donald Trump that, by the way,
that's a very good point. Let me put that to Professor Dershowitz immediately. So, Professor Dershowitz, we're talking about reputational damage of being associated very closely with Israel, and by all means rebut it, but you'll have to do so in the context of the International Criminal Court beginning in March this year, an investigation into alleged war crimes in the West Bank and Gaza, covering from 2014 to now, and the numbers of times that the United Nations has called Israel's occupation of the West Bank illegal, and the numerous occasions on which the United States has blocked UN resolutions condemning Israeli military action. How do you, in the face of all that, say that the United States does not suffer reputational damage?
So now it's 4 against 1, not just 3 against 1.
No, that's not fair. That's not fair. I'm presenting you with that's not fair, Professor Dershowitz. I'm presenting you with the facts as they are. Please give me an opportunity to respond. The best judge of what's in the best interest of the United States is American people, and the American people overwhelmingly support Israel because they know Hamas is a terrorist organization that murders gays, that discriminates against women, that murders its political opponents, that doesn't allow any free speech. Israel is a liberal democracy. Israel is a country that has 2 million Arab citizens who have equal rights, except they don't have to
in the army and there's no right of return. The plight of an Arab in Israel, particularly a Christian Arab, but also a Muslim Arab, is better than the rights of any Arabs in any country in the Middle East. And so Americans see through this. Americans understand it. Americans know that the relationship between Israel and the United States has helped both countries enormously. Israel is a startup nation. It helps develop American technology. Iron Dome was developed jointly. America uses its intelligence jointly with Israel to oppose Iran. And the idea of creating moral equivalence between a terrorist organization that uses human shields and targets civilians and Israel that tries its best to avoid civilian casualties is immoral itself. There is no moral equivalence. Americans that's why bipartisan support for America is still, for Israel by Americans, is still quite strong.
Malak, the key point from Professor Dershowitz for the purposes of this program is that it is in the interest for the United States to support Israel, because that is what the people of the United States vote for year after year. It's a democracy, and that's what you've got. You've got Joe Biden there, who is an avowed Zionist, and so on.
Let me tell you what the United States and Israel collaborate on. They collaborate with intelligence. They collaborate in ensuring that they are able to surveil and suppress resistance in any form that it comes in, especially for minority populations. They collaborate in police trainings abroad. So the LAPD, the NYPD, they take trips to learn how to be especially brutal to ethnic minorities in Palestine. What else do they collaborate on? Investing in prisons.
Malak, I'm sorry to interrupt, but would you mind just addressing the question? The point that Professor Dershowitz made is that the people of the United States have chosen the government that supports Israel, and it has been, until now at least, a vote winner in every election for decades.
Oh, yes, and I want to speak to that. The reality is, when you want to see where things are going, you look at activists and what they're calling for and how they're propelling change. What are Americans becoming increasingly aware of? Americans are becoming, especially after the Trump era, increasingly aware of the harm that the U.S. government perpetrates against its own populations and against populations abroad. Israel is not a democracy. Israel has been deemed an apartheid state by Human Rights Watch, even Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem. You can read the legal analysis by the Yesh Din organization. All of these organizations are established and grounded in international law when studying the apartheid structure in Israel. How do we see that exemplified? Jewish-only towns, Jewish-only schools, the erasure of Palestinian culture, villages, entire communities, dual legal systems.
Let me bring that back to Professor Dershowitz. Professor Dershowitz, one final question for you as we're coming towards the end of the program. Just a point that Malak raised, which is if you want to see the direction of a country, and she's referring to the United States, take a look at what's happening with regards to activists and people on the streets. And indeed, as you already alluded to, the small but growing group, it would appear, of young Congress people in the Democratic Party. Doesn't that indicate to you that America is changing, and that its support for Israel is not as unconditional as it once was?
There's always been activism, always been the hard left that is opposed to Israel, that singles out Israel, that applies a double standard. The key is to look at the mainstream. You don't look at the extremists on the right. You don't look at the extremists on the left. You look at the mainstream, and the mainstream still overwhelmingly supports Israel, and the President of the United States, the Secretary of State, they support Israel. They know better than the guests on this show what's in the best interest of the United States. They were elected to serve the best interest of the United States, and they know that a sharp alliance between Israel and the United States and a rejection of Hamas terrorism. The United States has declared Hamas to be a terrorist organization, as has many European countries. The apartheid label is totally false. Israel is an extraordinarily integrated country. Saudi Arabia is apartheid. Hamas is apartheid. They segregate by religion. They segregate by gender, by sexual orientation. Israel is a liberal democracy, and Americans understand that. And I have no fear of continuing American support for Israel, and a hope that maybe the American support will lead the Palestinians to sit down and come up with a two-state solution. There'll still be the problem of Hamas. Hamas,
Professor Dershowitz,
easily.
You made your point. I have to bring in Nader here. We're just coming to the end of the program. Nader, a final point from you.
Yeah, the question is not whether the American people or American government should support Israel. They clearly do. The question is, should the American government support the people of Palestine? Should they support equal rights, human rights, national rights for the Palestinians? I think a growing number of Americans have come to that position.
Nader HaShemi, Mark Perry, Malak Shalabi, and Professor Alan Dershowitz, thank you all for your contributions to the Nexus today. Much appreciated. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. Remember, if you want to see this episode or any of our other episodes, see our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus TRT World. Until next week, then, goodbye.